in the beginning, God said, let there be, everyone finish it, light. Let there be light. I also would have accepted hip-hop music or tacos. Those clearly came from God as well. Can I get an amen on that? But in the beginning, at least according to Genesis, God said, let there be light. And then there was. And although many in the science community don't agree necessarily that there is a divine architect behind that moment of creation, they do agree, generally speaking, that at the beginning of time, there was a bang. And apparently that bang was pretty big. We call it the Big Bang. And since the Big Bang, the universe has continued to expand according to the science community, generally speaking, for 13.8 billion years. We'll talk more on that later. But according to Genesis, after God created the waters and the land, after God created the sun and the moon, after God created the animals that fly in the sky and walk on the ground and swim in the waters, and then, of course, God creates his masterpiece, his great masterpiece of all, he creates humans. God declares over all of creation that creation was good. And then in the end, he takes it even further. He says, no, it's very good. And creation was very good. At least until it wasn't, right? Because in Genesis 3, only a couple chapters after this moment that God speaks over the goodness over all creation, we get to the part of the human story where we see, if you're familiar with it, Adam and Eve, representative of humans and God's creation, they decide that they're going to take a stab at being their own gods. And if you know the story, then you know that the story doesn't really end well. The world God created in this moment that humans tried to become their own gods, this world God created that was once so good, in fact, it was very good, is disrupted. And as a result of this disruption, there is a disconnection. A disconnection, Genesis tells us, between humans and the earth, humans and other humans, and most devastatingly, between humans and God. And then we turn to Genesis chapter 4. And Genesis chapter 4 through Genesis chapter 11 is the author, and we don't know who the author is. Some think it's maybe Moses, but we don't know. But we do know this. The author takes us on this journey from Genesis 4 through Genesis 11, sort of documenting the unfolding and unraveling of the human story. Because from Genesis 4 to Genesis 11, humans keep attempting to become their own God. And it turns out again and again and again that humans make terrible gods. They still do. And from Genesis chapter 4 to Genesis chapter 11, we begin to see just these various atrocities take place in the human story. First, you see the story of Cain and Abel, where violence and murder is introduced to the human story for the first time as Cain kills his brother Abel. You have the first case of incest between Noah and his son. And then you have a man named Lamech, who creates the first ever systematic oppression of women through polygamy. And then by Genesis chapter 11, you have humans with their newest technological advancement, the brick. The brick was like the iPhone 13 Pro of the ancient world. And in the ancient world, they began to leverage this newfound technology, the brick, for their own greedy and prideful purposes. I know it's hard to believe people using technology for their own greed and prideful agendas, but that is what happened in Genesis 11, where they begin to take this newfound technology and build a tower. Why? So that they could make their own names great. And by the end of Genesis chapter 11, we see as a result of everything going on in the world that humans are scattered and divided. And so by the end of Genesis chapter 11, there's sort of this underlying question the author's asking everyone reading the story. There's a question humming underneath Genesis 4 through Genesis 11, and that question is there any hope for this world? By the time you get to Genesis 11, you might conclude there's no hope for this world. This world has been completely disrupted, completely disconnected, completely taken away from what its original intent was. But then we cut to Genesis chapter 12. And we're introduced in Genesis chapter 12 to my second favorite. I almost said my first favorite character in the Bible, but that's Jesus. I'm pretty sure if Jesus isn't my first favorite character, I'm going straight to hell. So Abraham is my second favorite character of all time in the Bible. And in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, Abraham's story begins. And it begins with God doing something new. And what did God do? God spoke intimately to this man named Abraham. And when God speaks to Abraham, he tells him that he needs to leave his country, he needs to leave his relatives, and he needs to leave his father's house. And he says, if you leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, if you follow me where I'm taking you, then you will become a great nation, and this nation will be a blessing to all of the world. Now, that last part of the promise, where God says you need to leave your father's household, if we're just reading it literally, you might think what God is calling Abraham to do is to leave the house that he grew up in, to leave the house that he learned how to walk in, to leave the house that he grew up into an adult in. You know, it's time to move on. And that doesn't seem like that radical of an idea. After all of us have left our father's house at some point. But that's not what the author is talking about, not at least to the ears of the ancient world that was listening to this story unfold for the first time, because the father's house, it was actually symbolic, not of a literal house, but it was symbolic of all of your worldviews. It was symbolic of all the views that you had about God. It was symbolic of all your philosophy, all your ideologies, all of your theologies. Everything that you were told is how the world works was represented in that statement. Leave your father's house. So essentially, God says, hey, look, I'm going to make you into a great nation that will make you a blessing to the corners of the earth. But here's the deal. You're going to have to leave behind everything you think you know about how it works behind. You're going to have to leave your philosophies, your ideologies, your theologies, because what I'm doing is going to be a brand new thing. I think a lot of times we think Abraham was living in this sort of monotheistic world, but he wasn't. He was living in a polytheistic world, meaning the worship of many gods. In fact, according to Jewish tradition, they believe that Abraham's father was an idol merchant. So he not only worshiped other gods, he made money off of other gods. Which, by the way, this is sort of a side note. If you're here and you were not raised by people who fear and follow and worship Jesus, and you're wondering, can God really use a person like me? Abraham is a reminder to each and every one of us that your family line does not have to determine the plot line of your life. God is inviting Abraham into this new thing, a new understanding of God, where you could have an intimate relationship with not many gods, but with one God, and this one God's name was Yahweh. But here's the deal. You're going to have to leave behind everything you think you know about how the whole thing works. And you're just going to have to trust me. And I'll show you along the way how this whole thing is going to go. Isn't that annoying? All my type A planner people, you're like, I would have some questions for God. But Abraham doesn't get a blueprint. Abraham doesn't get answers. He doesn't even get a map. All Abraham gets is a whisper that invites him to step out of what he's always known and into something he was created to know. And what's crazy about the story of Abraham is not so much that God calls him to leave everything he knew behind and to venture into the unknown, to experience what he was created to know. That's crazy. But what's even crazier is Abraham does it. That Abraham actually follows this whisper of this God that he had yet to really know. He follows this God into something new. And in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, 3 words that would change the human story forever were written. So Abraham departed. Can we just say that out loud together? So Abraham departed, or Abram. He eventually becomes Abraham. Now, this is one of my favorite verses because it's absolutely a huge moment, not only for the life of Abraham, but for the life of all people who would follow Abraham. Because people did not do what Abraham just did at this time. The risk was too great. You would risk your family, you would risk your economic status, you would risk your comfort. You would be putting all of that on the line, and yet Abraham was willing to do that, to explore where this voice was leading him. See, the widespread understanding in Abraham's world was that the history of the world was this sort of endless cycle. Abraham was raised in Mesopotamia. And if you know anything about the history of Mesopotamia, then you know that the wheel was actually invented in 4th millennium BC in lower Mesopotamia. And of course the wheel was like their first invention because the wheel, the circle, was representative of how they viewed how all of life worked. All of life was cyclical. Everything that happened before would happen again. What happened to your grandparents would happen to your parents. What happened to your parents would happen to you. What happened to you will happen to your kids. What happened to your kids will eventually happen to your grandkids. This is just how the world works. Everything now is simply a repeat of what came before it. And so this story about Abraham stepping out of the cycle because something was leading him somewhere that he had no idea where or what it would look like. And Abraham's step forward was a step forward for the entire human race. Because all of a sudden, Abraham's movement out of the cycle would have given other people all sorts of permission to ask questions like, wait, you can step out of the cycle? Wait, all that is not all there is? You can actually do and experience something new that has yet to be experienced before? This was a new and revolutionary idea. And what's even more mysterious about the story of Abraham is that the writer of Genesis only tells us that the only assurance, the only thing Abraham got was that he heard God. Which seems odd, right? It's kind of vague, it's kind of fuzzy. Like you're just going to move on this holy hunch that God is leading you outside the cycle that we were always told we need to and will always live in. Like you're just moving on a hunch. But maybe that's part of the point of Abraham's story. Maybe the story of Abraham is giving us a glimpse into how all of life works. That something rises up within you, something inside your soul. Sometimes it feels like a powerful, invisible force. And then other times it feels like a still and gentle whisper. But something compels us to go and to explore and to cross boundaries and to see what happens because maybe there's more to life than the cycle you were given. Maybe all that is not all there is. And sometimes all you're going to have is a holy hunch, a holy sort of whisper inviting you to go and see what God is up to. I love that Abraham's nickname among the Hebrew people, his nickname was Ha-Ivri. Ha-Ivri. And Ivri means to cross over. And Ha-Ivri means the one who crossed over. So Abraham would go down. His legacy, which is not a bad one, is the one who crossed over. I don't know about you. I would love, that'd be awesome on my tombstone. Like the one who crossed over. Abraham was the first to cross over from here to there. He was the first to say, I see the cycle, but I'm going to cross the borderline of that cycle and see what lies on the other side. I'm going to cross over from all that is to all that there might be awaiting me on the other side. Abraham's story is a story of someone going from existing to living, from conformity to creativity, from standardization to innovation. And Abraham's story invites us all to do the same. Which obviously brings me back to the origin of the universe. In the beginning, roughly 13.8 billion years ago, the universe was a single point of infinitely compressed mass. And I'll just keep talking like we all know what that is. We all come from this single point that contained everything that would eventually become everything. At first, there was just this single point, and then there was a bang. And in a split second after that bang, there were only particles, bits and pieces of swirling and leaping and frenetic energy. That was it. Nothing else existed at this point in time in the universe, just those particles. And then roughly 3 minutes into the life of the universe, because someone was there counting, obviously, those particles began to bond with other particles. Now, can we just pause and acknowledge for a moment that we don't know a whole lot? We have more questions than answers, but how amazing is it that humans have advanced to the point that we know what happened the first 3 minutes of the existence of the universe? I think that's awesome. I think science is great. We don't fear science here. We think it actually gives us clues to what God is like. But 3 minutes in, the particles began bonding with other particles, and those particles bonding with other particles all of a sudden produced atoms. And the universe hadn't seen atoms up until this point. Atoms was a new thing. Particles coming together with other particles and creating atoms was something that had not been experienced or seen before in the history of the universe. And then the universe was feeling itself, so it kept going. Because roughly 300,000 years later into the life of the universe, those atoms that came from particles, they merged with other atoms, and those atoms combined with other atoms, creating molecules. Are you still with me? The world at this point has never seen molecules before. Molecules were new. Molecules are made of bonded atoms that came from bonded particles. And not only were molecules new, but they were deeper and bigger and more complex than what came before it. And then you got to wait for it, because after just a little bit more time, the particles came together and formed atoms, and the atoms came together and formed molecules. Then the molecules came together and they formed cells. And cells eventually would become all of life as we know it. What started as a single point of energy experienced a bang. And since that big bang, the particles became atoms, and the atoms became molecules, and the molecules became cells, and the universe has continued to expand more and more and more. By the way, according to the Doppler effect, our universe, even 13.8 billion years later, is still expanding. The 4 words that God spoke at the beginning of time, "Let there be light," is still creating galaxies at the edge of the universe. Now, I know that you probably all know where I'm going with this, but just in case you're not sure where I'm going with it, let me just get to my point here. You as humans, me as a human, you, us together as humans, we are, biologically speaking, a culmination of particles, atoms, molecules, and cells, which means there is not only a universe around you, there is a universe within you. That you are made with the same material as the universe. And if God created the universe to continue to expand, perhaps God has always invited humans like you and I to do the same. Are you with me? Just as the universe is at this very moment continuing to expand to the edges of the universe into something deeper and more beautiful and more complex, could it be that you and I are most actively human, and you and I are most fully alive when we continue as human beings to expand into something deeper and more beautiful as well? After all, you're made with the same material as the universe. And maybe this is why no one looks at a person who has thought the same way their entire life as a source of inspiration. Like, none of us look at the person, they have never changed it. They've never learned anything new. They have thought the same way from 20 that they do at 80. Woo, I hope I'm like them when I'm 80. No one thinks, you look at that and you go, it seems like we should be better than that. It seems like we should go deeper than that. Maybe it is the universe within you that causes you to be so angry and resentful over that one time when you were in church and you began to ask questions about God, and you began to share doubts about God, and you began to challenge what maybe other people have always seemed to believe about the Bible, and you started pushing it a little bit too far, so far, in fact, that maybe your Sunday school teacher or the preacher or a well-intentioned parent said, "Hey, we don't go there. We don't ask those questions." And there was like something in you that just knew that wasn't okay, something in you that was bothered by that moment where you were just trying to go deeper, and someone said, "No, we don't expand any further than that." Maybe it's the universe within you and this material that is within you that makes resentment so toxic in the life of a human being. I mean, resentment, if you look at the word, where it comes from, the French word, it comes from the French word ressentir. And if you break down that word, ressentir, sentir means to feel. So what is resentment? It means to re-feel. Resentment is re-feeling those wounds. Resentment is re-feeling the abandonment, re-feeling the failure, re-feeling the rejection. Resentment is when you choose to re-feel whatever it is you've been feeling again and again and again. And we've never seen someone who has resented their way into a better life, have we? Because resentment keeps you exactly where you are when you are made with material that is always inviting you to expand into something new and deeper and more beautiful. Maybe this is why purpose matters so deeply, and it doesn't matter whether you're a follower of Jesus or not. Next to the Bible, the greatest selling book of all time is Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life. Why is that book so popular? Maybe it's because there's something in us. Like we're made of a certain material that is always inviting us to explore, to be curious, and to be a pioneer of the new thing that God is wanting to do in your life. Maybe it's because every particle and every molecule and every atom and every cell within your being is crying out that there's more. And by the way, if you're hearing this, and I'm just going to venture to, I'm going to guess that a few of you are thinking this. You might be hearing this message, you're like, Travis, I've heard a lot of your sermons. This is the most hippie one you've ever given. This is like the most hippie sermon I've ever heard in my life, and you think I'm just making something up. I'm actually just echoing what Paul said quite some time ago. Romans chapter 1, verse 20, Paul, he writes this, he says, "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God." So what's Paul saying? He's saying you can look at the universe around you, you can look at creation around you, and the visible creation gives us a clue about what the invisible God is like. Paul seemed to believe that creation gives us clues that leads us to the heart and character of God. So why can't the universe do the same? And if it is, then perhaps this ever-expanding universe is a picture of what God is like and what he has invited you and I to be like as well. I mean, besides Jesus, you got to ask, like, why is the story of Abraham such a big deal to so many people? Because besides Jesus, Abraham is without doubt the most influential person who has ever walked this earth. Today, Abraham is claimed as the spiritual ancestor to 2.4 billion Christians, 1.6 billion Muslims, and 13 million Jews. That's a lot of followers on Instagram. And they all say, "Father Abraham, yeah, he's my father. We all come from him." And yet this person who has such an incredible and historic following, he ruled no empire, he commanded no great army, he never won a battle, he never performed a miracle, he never predicted a prophecy that came true. So what did Abraham do that warrants him such notoriety? He decided to follow the voice of God. He decided that he would step out of the cycle. He decided that he would see if maybe there is more than meets the eye in this life, that maybe all that is not all there is, and Abraham gave his life to exploring it and following the whisper of God and seeing what God does on the other side of his obedience. Maybe the story of Abraham is so compelling because in Abraham's story, we see the story that you and I are all invited into as well. Like we look at Abraham, we're like, yeah, maybe that's an invite for me as well to be a person who crosses over. Maybe like Abraham, in order to expand, it's going to require you leaving your father's house. And for some of you, perhaps you were born and raised in a Christian father's house or a church father's house, and you were told, this is how we talk about God. This is what we believe about God. We don't cross those lines. We don't challenge those concepts. We don't ask those questions. We don't share those doubts. But something in your heart is telling you, if you're going to experience something that you've never experienced with God, you're going to have to depart your father's house as well. Maybe it will require leaving something old for something new. Leaving something that you were told is just the way it is to see if maybe there's more. Maybe it means challenging how you were always taught to think about God and how the whole thing works. And it's not because you have a map or a manual or because you have all the answers, but you just have something whispering in you, beckoning you into something deeper and more beautiful. And maybe something inside of you is convinced that all that is not all there is. And if you're going to expand, if you're going to experience the new that God is going to do, you're going to have to start crossing some lines and leaving some fathers' houses. And this reminds me of this line that Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. It's this really interesting line. Paul writes, he says, but test everything that is said and hold on to what is good. Test everything that is said and hold on to what is good. And I love this line because there's like so much energy to it. But what's interesting about this line from Paul is that in the original Greek, it actually means welcome everything. So if you want to read this literally how Paul wrote it, Paul wrote, welcome everything that is said and hold on to what is good. Wouldn't that be an awesome way to live your life? I mean, how many fights would we get away from? How much more could we learn if we're like, ooh, you think differently? Instead of me telling you how you're wrong, tell me more about how you got to where you are. I'm going to hold on to what is good. I'm going to hold on to what is good. I'm going to welcome everything. See, Paul seems to believe there's two ways you can live your life. You can live your life as an expert, or you can live your life as an explorer. And Paul seems to believe that living your life as an explorer is more in line with who God has called us to be. See, experts are confident that they know things, but explorers are equally, if not more confident, that there are more things to know. Experts lead with statements, but explorers, they lead with good questions. Experts say, nope, this is just how it is. We've always thought this way. We've always believed this way. This is just, the Bible said it. That settles it. Now forget it. That's what experts do. Explorers say, but what if there's more? What if we haven't seen the whole picture yet? If I can be real with you, sometimes I worry that discipleship in the church has been distilled into a program to make us experts for Jesus. So we're like, take the 10-week program, memorize these scriptures, and the more you know, the more you're like an expert, then like the more in alignment you are with the heart of God. And so we tend to gravitate towards these experts that they know a lot of things, and they sound so smart when they say it. So they obviously must know God in a way that like I don't know God. And so we tend to elevate the experts in the church as a form, if not the top form, of discipleship, which is, of course, why I hear so many people in the church world, and maybe you've heard it as well, that they'll pick up the Bible and they say, this is like your manual on life. It's never worked for me. Has it worked for you? Like, has that metaphor really worked for you? Like, I wasn't born or raised in the church where that was just normal, so I remember coming in and hearing that, I'm like, a manual? That's boring. Like that, I don't know about you, but like, I never needed a midweek inspiration and went and got my car manual. I was never like depressed and anxious about life, I'm like, but then I read the manual for my microwave and woo, I felt good after that. No. Like we call it a manual, or I've heard people say, the Bible stands for basic instructions before leaving earth. You've been in church for a while if you've heard that before. Like as if the whole thing is about leaving here, which by the way isn't the whole thing. But it's this idea of, well, just follow the instruction manual. Just check the boxes. Just learn the thing. And this is the way of the expert. I hope we as a church that we can maybe begin as a church to reject the manual version of the Bible and reclaim the manifesto version of the Bible and see it as not a manual, but a manifesto of hope and wonder and love. Not just a book that we read, but a story that reads us and invites us to keep expanding. See, explorers welcome everything, and they know how to hold on to what is good. Now, by the way, you might be asking right now, because this whole idea of like, ooh, welcome, like, do you mean everything? What's the fine print here? And you might be asking, is this like actually okay? Like, would Jesus be cool with what you're talking about? Which is a good question to ask. After all, he's the center of this church, and we're trying to practice the way of Jesus. So we should ask that. Is Jesus okay with that? But if you read the stories of Jesus, the same ones that I read, then you've probably picked up on that Jesus had this tendency to answer questions, not with answers, but he would answer questions with more questions. So you would come to Jesus and you would ask him a question, and then Jesus would say, well, what do you think? How do you read it? How do you interpret it? What do you say about it? I know you're coming to me for answers, but let me ask you a question. I mean, if Jesus is trying to get experts, this is a terrible way of going about it. If this is an attempt at brainwashing, I mean, Jesus is doing the exact opposite thing you should do. If indoctrination is what Jesus is after, then Jesus is doing it, he's doing it wrong. I mean, this is the opposite of just believe it and don't ask questions. No. When you read the stories of Jesus, he answers questions with more questions because he's always inviting people to think critically, to examine thoughtfully, to question humbly, to doubt honestly, to test thoroughly, and to struggle wholeheartedly with it. Why? So you can have your own faith, not a hand-me-down one. I wish you'd hear me on this because I'm so tired of seeing people in their mid-40s having a crisis of faith because they get in their mid-40s and they realize they never had faith. They just had their parents. They never actually owned what they believed. They were just wearing a hand-me-down faith, and eventually it began to have holes and wear down and no longer work anymore. And Jesus is always inviting us to have our own faith as well. In fact, Jesus, if you're one who champions traditions, Jesus had to annoy you when you read them through the Gospels. Because Jesus was always challenging long-held traditions if it was getting in the way of what God is doing. Like in Mark chapter 7, verse 13, Jesus said to the religious experts, and these religious experts, they were actually using religious tradition, good religious tradition, to avoid helping their parents in need. That's how bad it had gotten. And in Mark chapter 7, Jesus lays into them and he says, you cancel the word of God in order to hand down your own tradition. And this is only one example among many others. Jesus is like, you have this thing that you do, and that is that you create traditions and you elevate doctrine and you take these things that are good things, but you're using these good things to give you a pass from doing the ultimate things that I've invited you to do. And Jesus is like, no, not having it. That's not what I'm about. These religious experts were convinced that God looked and behaved a certain way, and so they created their own traditions and their own doctrines and their own dogma that people had to sign off on to be good with God. But all of this was getting in the way of the main thing that God was wanting to do in the lives of people. And it still can sometimes, can't it? Far too often people experience, and I know this because I happen to have a lot of conversations with people who have tried out churches or who have left the church, who have abandoned faith or are not sure about their faith. And I'll tell you what, I've never met a person who has rejected faith because of Jesus. Never met that person, but I've met plenty of people who've rejected faith because of the church. And it's because they entered into a church, and before they could actually know Jesus, they had to pass through the three barriers called tradition, dogma, and doctrine. Maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, it was like, hey, look, if you're going to love Jesus like we obviously love Jesus, then you need to check this box and this box and this box. And they're like, you're totally welcome here. That is, unless you don't check those boxes, then you're kind of not welcome here. But that seems backwards to me. Does it to you? That we would make people go through tradition, dogma, and doctrine before they get to Jesus? Shouldn't we just start with Jesus and allow Jesus to shape our dogma, doctrine, and tradition? Shouldn't we make accessing Jesus the easiest thing possible? I said Jesus. I heard you, Lydia. Ha, ha, ha. Stand up here. All right. We shouldn't. And yet, we're all guilty of this. Gosh, the longer you're a Christian, the more you are certain your tradition and your dogma and your doctrine is obviously right. We have thousands of denominations that all read the same Bible and claim to follow the same Jesus, and yet we just all have different beliefs about how the whole thing works. Maybe we should simplify it and just start with Jesus. So why am I talking about all this? What does Abraham, the expanding universe, welcoming all things, and Jesus' tendency to challenge tradition have to do with you and me and us in 2022, in this church, in this city, in this time? I'm talking about this because maybe for some of you, you have been standing on the doorstep of your Father's house for some time now. You've been standing on the doorstep of your Father's house, but you have yet to depart into what God is whispering in your heart because you fear, if I leave my Father's house, I'm going to be homeless. I'm not going to have anywhere to belong. Maybe some of you have felt like God is trying to take that universe within you and expand it to make room for new understanding of God, and you've resisted it because in order to expand, you would actually have to begin to challenge some things that you were told you should never challenge, let alone question. I'm talking about this because if you're going to free the butterfly and see who God is rise to new heights, and who you are and your faith rise to new heights, then the next pin that some of us might just need to take out of the butterfly is the pin of conformity. Because let me remind you, discipleship, at least according to Jesus, has never been and will never be about standardization, but it will always be about transformation. This is why Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5:17, it's in Christ we are new creations. We're new because transformation and expansion is what God is like and created us to be like as well. Because if the universe is any clue to us, like Paul says, on how God works and who God is, then the universe testifies and is still testifying and has been testifying the past 13.8 billion years that God is inviting us into an expansive and beautiful and immeasurable future. So my question that has just been like in my heart for all of you so much, the question this entire message started from, is the question, how is love beckoning you? How is love beckoning you? Like, let me ask it differently. What is love beckoning you to leave behind? Maybe for some of you, it's leaving behind a relationship. You thought you've been like moving forward, but you haven't, and love is actually beckoning you. It's time to move forward. Maybe for some of you, it's beckoning you to begin to leave behind what you've always known and what you were always told is true. And it's not just saying like we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's not saying we don't appreciate that, but it is beginning to say, hey, look, I am going to explore what God is doing, and I'm going to begin to just take the pin of conformity out and see what God does on the other side of it. Where's love beckoning you? And who is love maybe beckoning you to forgive? Maybe it's not so much something you need to leave behind, but it's someone you need to forgive, and love is beckoning you to forgive. There's this powerful scripture in the New Testament where Jesus says, look, if you bring like a sacrifice to the altar of the temple, but you are still holding on to bitterness against someone else, he's like, you need to leave your sacrifice, you need to go and get forgiveness, you need to handle that, because what you're doing here is nothing if you cannot forgive and let go. Because you will continue to shrink in that posture of resentment. I wonder if love is beckoning you to forgive someone. Where is love beckoning you to go? For some of you, perhaps it's to leave your job. For others of you, maybe it's to explore a part of the world you've never been before, because God's trying to expand your understanding of this global God and this world that He created. And maybe love is beckoning you to go somewhere you've never gone before. How is love beckoning the universe within you to begin to expand, to make room for the new that God has created you to experience? And maybe you're here today because God has been whispering something to you, like Abram, you just hear this gentle whisper. There's not much more than that. It's a little vague, it's a little fuzzy. You're like, if I tell you that I've heard this whisper, you'll think I'm crazy, but I'm hearing it, and I think I need to follow it. Then love is beckoning you to depart and see where it goes. And maybe today there's some of you have experienced over the last 2 years something maybe like what I've experienced, which is like a big bang in your soul. And you're like, right now it's just a bunch of particles. But I need to see what these particles will turn into. I need to see what God is up to. I need to depart and follow the voice and expand and see where God is going. See, in Genesis 12, when God decided to redeem the world, He started by inviting a person to follow God into the new thing that He was making. And some of us are like, how is God going to fix this hot mess of a world that we find ourselves in today? I think it's through people. I think God's plan A is still people. And just as the universe around us is going somewhere, God is inviting the universes within us to go somewhere as well and to be a part of the new thing that God is going to do in the world. Which means this, and I'll wrap up with this. Every morning that you wake up and face your fears, and every morning you wake up and you face your insecurities, and every moment you wake up and you decide, I am going to step out of the cycle, I am going to cross the border, I am not going to believe that all that is all there is. Every morning you wake up and you make that decision to follow the whisper of the voice of God wherever that whisper will lead you. Every time you do that, you are participating in the expansion and in the renewal of all things.